Good morning. Good to see everyone. I think it's supposed to be a little bit cooler this week. I'm ready for that. And some sunshine too. If you will, turn to number 379. 379. Oh, for a faith that will not shrink. Oh, for a faith that will not shrink, though pressed by every foe, that will not tremble on the brink of any earthly woe, that will not murmur or complain beneath the chastening rod, but in the hour of grief or pain will lean upon its God. A faith that shines more bright and clear when tempests rage without, that when in danger knows no fear, in darkness feels no doubt. Lord, give us such a faith as this, and then whate'er may come, we'll tasting here the hallowed bliss of an eternal home. Dennis, would you start us off?
Holy Father, we bow in prayer this morning, thanking you for the freedoms that we enjoy in this land and for the blessing of coming together to study a portion of your word. Thankful, Father, for the book of Isaiah. We pray that you bless us in our efforts to learn more from it. We pray that you be with Mike as he directs our class. Help us, Father, as participants, that our minds might be centered indeed upon your truths. We thank you, Father, for the church here in Mexico. And we pray for the spreading of the gospel here and throughout the world. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Isaiah chapter 5. Last week we pointed out the fact that chapter 5 of Isaiah is different from the first 4 chapters. While chapters 2 through 4 point out the deficiencies of Israel's morals as in their service to God, chapter 5 is approached by way of a parable, but still bringing out in this parable the same sins that have been pointed out in the first 4 chapters. In the first 2 verses of chapter 5, Isaiah begins with what? Remember what he begins with? Begins with the song. Oh yeah, you weren't in here, were you? Begins with the song in the first 2 verses directed about God, not necessarily about God himself, but concerning God's vineyard that he planted, which represents the nation of Israel. How God found the perfect place to plant this vineyard, how he took great care in picking the choicest vines, prepared the soil, removing all the rocks, in other words, all the hindrances the Israelites would face. But when the harvest came, he had every expectation of receiving a great harvest. Grapes of perfection. But instead he found wild, putrid grapes, demonstrating that the sin of the people, ignoring what God had done for them, choosing to become like the nations around them, not as God would have them to be. This song of the vineyard represented the nation of Israel and its downfall into ungodliness. Verse 3, Isaiah then transitions from the song into the parable that we'll find through the remainder of the chapter. Jehovah asks his people, "What could I have done to prevent the present situation?" This, of course, is a rhetorical question. We know God has done everything possible for them, but it's they who made the choice to turn against him. Therefore, as they were warned in chapters 2 through 4, and they would pay the price for their unfaithfulness because they refused to repent. He continues here in verse 16 to 30, bringing out what's going to happen because of their sins. Now, we talked about this warning and the punishment possibly being referring to the Babylonian captivity, 164 years into the future. But as we continue, that may not be the case. And we'll see that in a moment. Verse 16, "But Jehovah of hosts is exalted in justice, and God the Holy One is sanctified in righteousness. Then shall the lambs feed as in their pasture, and the waste places of the fat ones shall wanderers eat. Woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, and sin as it were with a cart rope, that say, Let him make speed, let him haste his work, that we may see it. And let the counsel of the Holy One of God draw nigh and come, that we may know it. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine, men of strength to mingle strong drink, that justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as the dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root shall be as rottenness, and their blossom shall go up as dust, because they have rejected the law of Jehovah of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore is the anger of Jehovah kindled against this people, and he has stretched forth his hand against them, has smitten them, and the mountains tremble, and their dead bodies are as refuge in the midst of the streets. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. He will lift up an ensign to the nations from far, and will hiss for them from the end of the earth. And behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. None shall weary nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep, neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosened, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken. Whose arrows are sharp, all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves shall be accounted as flint, their wheels as a whirlwind. Their roaring shall be like a lioness, they shall roar like young lions. Yes, they shall roar and lay hold of the prey. Carry it away safe, and there shall be none to deliver. They shall roar against them in that day like the roaring of the sea, and if one look unto the land, behold, darkness and distress, and the light is darkened in the clouds thereof. Remember, we talked last week about there being 6 woes pronounced against Israel. The first 2 we found last week in verse 8 and verse 11. Now, in verses 18, 20, 21, and 22, we'll finish these pronouncements with the final 4 woes upon the people. Back in verse 14, Isaiah spoke of Sheol opening wide its mouth to receive all who seek to glorify themselves over God. Notice he didn't say heaven was going to open wide its mouth to receive them, did it? Or Sheol is the place of what? Yeah, place of the deceased, yeah. Temporary abode of souls, yeah. Can you think of an equivalent word for Sheol? Sheol is the Hebrew word. In the New Testament, it's Hades. So it refers to the same place. So here in verse 16, Jehovah demands that he should be exalted. He's the only holy one. And as such, he should be sanctified, set apart from mankind and the false gods that they worship. Because the people of Israel had refused to exalt and sanctify Jehovah, he would prove that he indeed was the exalted one who has the authority to execute justice upon them. Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 23. Chapter 38 and verse 23. And this justice would come in the form of punishment when they would be taken by the nations. This manifestation of his righteousness would force them to admit, or at least should have forced them to admit, that God deserved to be exalted. He deserved to be glorified above themselves and above all false gods. Jerusalem would be swallowed up. It's going to be swallowed up twice. Well, I guess really 3 times. It's going to be swallowed up 3 times by Sheol. And we've already mentioned Babylon and the Romans. But there's a third before Babylon. Just like the company of Korah in Numbers 16. They too would be swallowed up and taken underground. Figuratively, often we look at Hades or hell underneath our feet and heaven up. But there's no direction really. But for us here in this life, we have to have direction. So as men and women walk upon the ancient ruins of Jerusalem today, the same is true of Babylon and Rome. They're nothing but ruins as well. The wastelands of Judah is what the remnant of Israel found when they returned home from Babylonian captivity in 536 BC. It was just nothing but wasteland. However, this was not so after Rome destroyed the city. It would be rebuilt. And the 12th century into the 14th century, the Muslims would take over the land during the Crusades. and much of the area would become wasteland and pastures as it is today. At one time, God is saying the land was fat with fullness. You know, they were prosperous. Everything was fertile. But after Rome finally destroyed it, it wasn't so. The second woe closes in verse 17, which is the longest of the 6 woes. Began in verse 11 and goes all the way to the end of verse 17. Now the third woe, verse 18. Directed against the strong-minded men of the nation who were responsible for calling God's judgment down upon the nation. We dare you, basically. We dare Jehovah to come upon us. Let us see it for ourselves. The idea here is that the people of Jerusalem were so ingrained in their sin, they had grown calloused toward it. They'd grown callous toward God. They dared God to come down and punish them. In the beginning, you know, he talks here about a rope, a cart rope. So in the beginning, their sins were like a slender hair from our head. Just barely starting. But as their sins steadily grew to the point of becoming common, one by one, those hairs began to be added on to one another until it became as thick as a cart rope, showing their sinfulness. You know, they never repented. They just kept adding to their sin. Their eagerness to commit sin finds them using this rope to pull sin towards them. More sin, more sin. It would never release. But in the end, their presumptuousness is going to find their efforts vain as God punishes them for it. And verse 19 shows the gall of these people, daring God to do something about the sins they're committing, about the sins they're reveling in. Let's see how fast God will call us out for our sinfulness. Let's see if He even will. They have been opposing God for so long, and God has not done anything to correct them, that they have falsely assumed that God doesn't care about their sins. But what do we find here with God allowing them to continue in their sin? It's not that He doesn't care because He's been sending His prophets to warn them to repent. But it speaks to God's patience. Speaks to His long suffering because He doesn't want anybody to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. 1 Peter 3:9, or 2 Peter 3:9, sorry. A lot like the people in the United States who constantly say, we're a Christian nation, therefore God's going to continue to bless us no matter what. But we're only a Christian nation in the sense that the majority of people claim Christianity. We're not a Christian nation because people live according to Christ's law, just that they claim Christianity. Everyone in the country was required to follow the law of Moses, God's law of the Lord. And they had left the majority of it behind. They were, just keeping just little bits and pieces of it that they liked, just enough to please God, so they thought. And it's basically the same here in this country. People think that as long as they believe Jesus is the Son of God, that they're following the gospel. That's all that needs to be done. Like the Jews of old, who assumed they could get away with establishing their own rules, and God would continually warn them through his prophets, but not punish them. These people are basically thumbing their nose at Jehovah, which is the same attitude that we find in this country, find in the world. God still warns men and women today, not through the prophets, but through his word, doesn't he? One day judgment will come, and the majority of people are going to be shocked, just as the Israelites were. I see examples in the Old Testament of God just continually warning them and them not repenting, and then he punishes them. And I think about this country and the things that are going on, and although I don't want to see it, God just might have to punish this country to get people woke up. Not woke, but we don't want that kind of woke. But to wake them up to realize they have not been living according to his will. And I don't want anybody to have to go through it, but if that's what God's going to do, that's what needs to be done. We often seen through the centuries that has always been the case, that people will go along and they'll begin to turn away from God, and then something happens in society that causes people, all of a sudden, the churches start filling up. And, that just may have to happen here again. The Israelites were so daring, they even scoffed at God's prophecies. They put them to death for warning them. In verse 20, we have the famous verse that many have quoted now and then, maybe not knowing exactly where it's found, but it's woe number 4. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. Sometimes we'll use that to refer to the attitude of people today, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. These people not only omit good in their lives, but they condemn others who are going about doing good. They're constantly arguing against good. And rather doing what's good, they partake in what evil thing they can find or they can invent. They promoted evil. They supported evil. They applauded evil. They justified evil. I can't help but think we're seeing a lot of that today. Not only are such individuals hurting themselves, but they're also doing society as a whole harm. You know, they talk about all this transgender business and homosexual marriage and that. Well, what harm? It's destroying the morals of society. Verse 21, we find woe number 5. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, prudent in their own sight. They think they're so knowledgeable that they can counter any judgments against them, which may seem like they are able to do so, but they're irrational. They're not sound arguments that really justify what they're doing. James chapter 4, verse 6 tells us what? That's Proverbs. Yeah, but yeah, it does talk about pride. God resists the proud. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Gives grace to the humble. Paul spoke to this attitude when he wrote to the Romans in the first century. When he said, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Romans 1:21. Solomon warned that we should never be wise in our own eyes. Proverbs 3 and verse 7. Kind of the same attitude as the Gnostics in the first century. The all-knowing ones. Verse 22, the final and sixth woe. Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine, men of strength to mingle strong drink. What do you think of when you see strong drink? Yeah. Huh? Whiskey, yeah, that kind of stuff, yeah. But that's not what it's talking about. They didn't have those kind of drinks back then. Everything that they had was fruit juice that they turned into alcohol. So strong drink, they would mingle, of course, wine. I saw a deal the other day. What does grape juice become when it comes sour? It becomes wine. No, it doesn't. It becomes vinegar. It ruins. It takes the actions of men to carefully manipulate that grape juice to become alcohol. There has to be a certain temperature, has to be so much leaven added to it, has to be sugar. You have to add all these things to it. It doesn't automatically turn into liquor. So what they would do back then, they would make it out of pomegranate juice, fig juice. They would have grape juice, just any kind of fruit that they would turn into a alcoholic drink. And mingling strong drink would be adding spices and herbs and other things like that to it. So they would mix all of these things together, dumping in the grape juice and the pomegranate juice and throwing in some spices and drinking it. So what God says here, they had become braggarts. They boasted they could hold their liquor. They could drink anybody under the table. So they were mighty to drink alcohol. We see the idea of this ingredients being added to make the drink stronger in Psalm 75, verse 8. Proverbs 23, verse 30 to 32 talks about it. So they were mighty. These were mighty men who could hold their liquor, drink all day and all night. Men of renown, rather than being the renown who avenged wrongs, helped widows and orphans. These were drunken heroes. Verse 24, Jehovah says they had become rottenness because they had cast away his righteous law. They despise the word of the Holy One of Israel. With all their sins that they have committed, they dare Jehovah to do something about it. As Isaiah's song expressed, this nation of people as a vineyard needing to be destroyed due to their prolonged bad fruit. God points out why this is the case. As a vine, Jehovah says there should be nothing found of a branch, let alone a root, above or below ground, just completely wiped out, utterly destroyed. And the way this is written in the Hebrew, it's speaking of a sudden disappearance of both at the same instant. As if a firestorm swept through the vineyard, devouring everything in its path in seconds. And I've never been in California when they have these fires, but they say those firestorms are what you really have to watch out for, because they sweep through in seconds and just completely devour everything. Did you ever see any of that when you were out there?
Between sweeping through Hustler Drive and then
Yeah.
flowing for miles,
Hmm.
setting fires at other
Mm-hmm.
locations. We had fires from started in Malibu and went all the way down to San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
This is about 90 miles away.
Yeah. Yeah. once those winds pick up and move that, it can't hardly keep up with it. Yeah. So verse 25, for this reason, Jehovah's wrath is kindled against his people. And this certainly points forward to the coming judgment. Not something of the past, but something that's coming. And this possibly here is what he's been talking about is a smaller judgment than the one that's going to happen under Nebuchadnezzar and under Rome. 2 Chronicles chapter 28 speaks of this very thing after the death of Uzzah, which is where Isaiah's call to prophecy, to be a prophet, began with Uzzah, through Jotham and Jotham's son Ahaz. Ahaz reigned and followed the ways of Jeroboam of Israel. He did that which was not right in God's sight, which then caused Jehovah to allow the king of Syria, Pekah, to come down and carry away over 200,000 men, women, and children. The text says it was a great slaughter, which would seem to fit verse 25 here. Carcasses in the street, Jehovah's outstretched arm sweeping through the city. And perhaps this was a warning shot to the people that God was serious. Okay, you challenged me? All right. You're not going to like it, but I'm going to show you. I'm going to try to wake some of you up if I possibly can. Now, again, this is not immediate, because at the time that Isaiah is preaching here, Uzzah is still king. So you got two more kings going to come in power. So, let's see. Jotham, I think he reigned 12 years. And Ahaz, I don't remember, but his was short too. Uzzah reigned 29 years. And we don't know exactly when Isaiah started during Uzzah's reign. Most think it was about the middle way through his reign. So this could be, as much as 25, 30 years in the future that this is going to come about. 2 Chronicles 28. Verse 26, the idea of nations from far become instruments of God's punishment, which goes back to 2 Chronicles chapter 28. The Edomites. Where did we hear about the Edomites? Talked about them on Wednesday night, didn't we, in Genesis? They're descendants of who? Esau. Yep. Yeah, so you got the Edomites, the Philistines, the Assyrians, all come to Judah. So what this banner of God was that announced to the other nations that Israel was vulnerable, we don't know. Could have been just word of mouth that got out. And it doesn't seem to matter what distance these other countries were from. They're marching to Israel. No one's exhausted. They can't wait to get there. They keep pressing on incessantly. They're so eager for battle that they don't even take the time to refresh themselves with a night's rest. Verse 28, Isaiah describes the weapons of these nations, they're rushing to be the first ones to Israel. They don't want the leftovers, they want the best of the spoils. So they want to be the first ones there. And they're not going to waste any time. They've already strung their bows. They got their bows ready. They have their arrows ready. As soon as they get there, they're going to let those arrows fly. Their horses and their chariots are moving like the whirlwind to get there. Now, the custom of shoeing horses was not practiced among the ancients. They chose horses with the firmest hooves. Homer called them brazen-footed horses. Talking about the roaring of the lion in verse 29, Isaiah here is speaking about their bloodthirsty war cries of these nations. Like the lion that lets out a roar to discomfort his prey. These war cries of the enemy are going to terrify the Israelites. They seize their spoils, they immediately carry it away. And like a flood, the enemy, once reaching Jerusalem, are not going to take time to rest. They've made it. They're going to jump right in and take the city. God tells his people, okay, I want you to look out on the land, a land that once brought you joy, and now it's nothing more than sorrow and hopelessness. Look up to heaven for God's help. Where once there was light, now there's great darkness. God has hidden his face from you. He's not hearing your cries for help. That's all. That was already offered once. You refused. It's too late now. So what Isaiah is saying here is that there will be times when it appears divine deliverance is near. But the ruin will quickly follow once again. It's going to occur in cycles. Each time they're going to think God has heard their cries. Now when we get to chapter 6, there's going to be a little bit of confusion when we get there because it contains a record of Isaiah's calling to his prophetic office. Now there's no doubt that the first 5 chapters are dealing with the war that ensues during the reign of Ahaz, not with the Babylonians as what I thought before. But it's going to be during the time of Ahaz's reign that the Assyrians are used by God to deliver punishment to Judah. In a smaller scale. I mean, they've come down to the northern kingdom of Israel to completely take it captive. And once they've gotten them, they think, well, we'll just move on south and go down to Judah. But God doesn't allow them to completely take them like he does Israel. And then other nations come in to mop up what is left, while at the same time causing havoc with Judah as a warning that God is serious. You called me to come down. Well, all right, here I am. So that's what we're going to see in chapter 6. Any questions? Comments? All righty, thank you.